It was a very strange time because prior to 94, you always had a very clear reason why you were a photographer. Your starting point was this big apartheid thing which hung over you, and in a way it was a restriction, but in a way it made life easy because you always knew where your starting point was. Towards the end of 94, I had a real strong feeling that I'd never really wanted to be a photojournalistic type photographer or to cover war and violence, and I made a very strong stand almost to say, okay, I'm going to stop that completely, and I never did sort of hard photojournalism news again. I spent a brief period in London in 1988, and I remember going to the Mandela's 79th birthday concert at Wembley. And there was a real sort of feeling in the air that Nelson Mandela was going to be released, fairly soon. I made a decision to work with a wire agency, Reuters, because it gave me enormous access to the events and to also know when things were happening. Suddenly the violence in Johannesburg started. And it started with a few deaths a day and rose rapidly to 50 deaths a day. And I'd never seen a dead body before, and it was an incredible shock. And I also felt a responsibility because I was the one holding the fort, really. And so suddenly I was thrust into this role of photographing violence and, I suppose, a sort of localized war. And it wasn't what it was never my intention. Thank you. What is your name? Thanks for letting us in. The violence and the extreme political changes that happened, I mean, they carried on for 5 years, between 89 and 94. Because during the apartheid time the townships were built very close to the cities but were significantly separate. There was a distinction between what was township area, black people were allowed to live, and the sort of suburbs where the white people live. But the result of that was that I would sometimes get up early in the morning and be in the townships photographing violence until mid-morning, and then I would wander home and try fit into a life of going shopping and possibly having a barbecue with friends. And then at the beginning you consider your life at home with friends and as your normal life, and your life photographing as this abnormal existence. But as one continued to do it, one's existence was sort of almost driven by adrenaline. At some point it almost felt it flipped over the edge, and that became my sort of real life. Towards the end of my sort of hard news type work in about 94, I was in there was an attempted coup in a place called Bophuthatswana in the northwest of South Africa. And I was in a situation where I was photographing a white right-winger shooting a woman who was running between shacks. And he shot her, and I'd photographed him, and then some other right-wingers saw me photograph him and came up, and as I was putting my camera down, the one hit me under the chin and then put a shotgun in my mouth, and luckily an older person walked past and said, don't shoot them, in Afrikaans, don't shoot them, beat them up. So it's one of the few times I was pleased to be beaten up. Hi, Mama. How's it going? Hey, how's it? Hello. I think following the violence, there was a very distinct period where I really had to come to terms with being back in the world and operating on a quieter level. Post 94, it really changed, and for me it was a strong sense of having to find the reason again why I was a photographer and what I wanted to photograph. And it took me a long time. It took 4 years in order to really get going, or to really sort of feel I was gaining some direction in terms of my work. So, you know, after photographing so much sort of negativity and the violence and the harsh politics that were happening here, it felt that this was a sort of opportunity to possibly re-look at how I'm going to portray a country which is so full of complex emotions and feelings. The way I approached my work was to try avoid the initial surface impact that news and photojournalistic photography gave. I mean, I had to have those other aspects which made one feel slightly off balance, slightly ill at ease, slightly unsafe. I tried to bring a sort of sense of a lyricism or softness on one level, but at the same time matching that with a deeper river of anger and violence. There was never one obvious subject to the photograph. It was always made up of different aspects, and I think that particular technique was important for me to get across the way that the country was such a mass of sort of positives and negatives, and that if one really engaged with all the sort of things that happened in the country, it would drive you nuts actually. So, you know, I wanted to get across that sense where you could never really get a grip on exactly what was happening. Living in this country, I think most of us live in a sort of post-traumatic stress situation. So what I really came to understand about my motivations for working is that it felt it needed to be about how I felt about my life, my country, my immediate surroundings. And so it was more a sense of how was I able to communicate a feeling or a mood